Good morning and welcome to everyone. How's everybody doing this morning? Can you hear me? Can you see me? All right, I'm used to on Zoom asking if people can see me, but I guess here if you can't see me, then that's more of a medical thing. I want to thank everybody for coming here. This is our first in-person adult ed program in a long, long time. The last time we had actual people here, there were still a few dinosaurs running around Sun City and Sun City West, and so it's very nice to see everybody here. I want to give a little bit of background about how this course came about and a little bit about who I am, and then I want to ask you a few questions. And so my name is Dana Kaplan, and I've been the rabbi here for the last 3 years. Before that, I was an interim rabbi in Alabama, and before that, I was rabbi in Jamaica, in Kingston, Jamaica, not Jamaica, New York, but Jamaica in the Caribbean. I grew up in New York City, and I went to a Jewish school from kindergarten through 6th grade, and I had over the first 14 years of my life 2 good friends who were both, as it turned out, Catholic. One was Haitian, and one was from a white guy from suburban Long Island. And so I went with each of them to their churches, which were both Catholic, but were very, very different congregations. And that was really the extent of my exposure to Jesus. Now, this course is going to focus on Jesus in his Jewish context. So we're really not talking about Christianity, which really started after Jesus' death. And I'll talk a little bit more about faith versus history and the difference between them in just a minute. The course came about where's Leonard?
Right here.
There's Leonard. So, and where's Michael? Okay. So these 2 gentlemen separately, have you met each other yet?
No.
Okay. But they've...
I think I met you once when we were both in a drunk tank, but we'll talk about it.
There's only I have a microphone, so you may or may not have heard what Michael said, but that is a test of your hearing. But separately, they both came to me and said, we'd like something more historical, and specifically about how Christianity started and who Jesus was. And Leonard can tell you after more exactly what he said. And in Leonard's case, he's married to Cheryl, and so you've been married how many years? 4 years. And so the deal that they made is Cheryl would come with Leonard on Friday nights to synagogue, and Leonard would go with Cheryl on Sunday mornings to church. Is that more or less the arrangement? And so they each they had a quite an intensive course in comparative religion. And in Leonard's mind, it brought up a lot of questions about Jesus that he hoped that I would be able to answer. So right at the beginning, let me just say that I'm going to be disappointing Leonard. So we really aren't going to be able to come up with any definitive answers today. But we'll at least raise the issues, and we'll try to have some interesting dialogue. Now, I mentioned the faith versus reason and the religion versus history dichotomy, and we want you to keep that in mind because we each have, most of us, although in America, the percentage of people who have some connection to a religion, a personal religion, is declining very rapidly. But probably most of us in this social hall do have a personal religion, something that we connect with in some ways. And we want to differentiate that from history, from what we might be trying to do here to see Jesus in his original historical context. And unfortunately, that's impossible completely to get an accurate portrayal of that because we're reliant upon sources. So the best sources would be people, if we could interview people who lived at the time. And if we can't interview them personally, if we could find videos of interviews that were done with them in their lifetimes. Unfortunately, neither of these things is possible. So we're reliant upon documents that they may have left. And unfortunately, there are none, as you probably know. The earliest records of Jesus are from Paul, and he wrote in the 50s. Jesus died, according to some, in 30, maybe 32 or 33. So there's a pretty close to 20 years between the time that Jesus died and the first written records about Jesus. Further, Paul never met Jesus and was not eyewitness to any of the events of Jesus' life. So we have a historical problem. Now, from a faith point of view, if you are a believing Christian, then none of that may matter. And so we believe what we believe, and we don't necessarily rely upon historical evidence for our beliefs. As Jews, we don't believe in Jesus as a central part or a part of any sort of religious system, and so these decisions are made on the basis of faith rather than on his history or anything like that. So when we're talking, sometimes we're going to talk on a historical level, and we want to stick with what we think might have happened and what evidence we have for that. On another level, we may talk as religious people, and so these are both fine. We want to try to differentiate what is our perspective at that given point. And so some of my questions might be, as a Jew or as a Christian, how do you react to that? That's a very different question than just as a person, what do you think happened, or how reliable is this source? So that's just a point about the difference between faith and reason. So let me ask a few questions here. So how many people here are members of this temple? Oh, a lot. And how many are Jewish but not members of this temple? Okay, 3. And how many are Christians? So quite a few. And of the Christians, how many are Lutheran? Methodist? There's a Methodist. United Methodist. No, not United. No. Presbyterian, Catholic, non-denominational, Baptist, Southern Baptist. And did I miss somebody? I must have missed. Oh, I'm sorry, Episcopalian. Yeah? Episcopalian? Quaker. Oh, Quaker. Okay. I went, say, Pentecostal. Okay. Seventh-day Adventist, anyone? No? Okay. So we have quite a variety of different type of people's background. Now, did anyone or did everyone bring a copy of the New Testament with them? Okay, so some of you have. And I want to just say a couple of words about that. So the book that I have is the Jewish Annotated New Testament. And so this is part of Jewish efforts to study Christianity. So a lot of Jews are scholars. We like being scholars. And so, many Jews, of course, study Judaism. But over the last 200 years, there's also been Jewish interest in scholarship about early Christianity and about Christianity in general. And so this is part of that tradition. It's edited by Amy Jill Levine and Marks V. Brettler. Amy Jill Levine is a Jewish woman, and she's a professor of New Testament studies at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, in Nashville. And she wrote a book on Jesus, the Misunderstood Jew, and which we didn't use. In the introduction of that book, she talks about being a little Jewish girl in, I don't remember where she was raised, and she saw something about the Pope, and so she decided she wanted to become the Pope. So her mother had to say, well, you can't be a Pope, you're Jewish and you're a woman. And she was very disappointed, but she eventually accepted that, and so instead she became a scholar of Christianity. And Marks V. Brettler is a Jewish biblical scholar. And so what they've done here is to write a commentary from a Jewish point of view. And the New Testament is a very Jewish book in many, many ways. And I found this out when I was in Jamaica, and I was teaching part-time at the theological college there, which was for training all of the different Protestant ministers. And I was team teaching a course with one of their professors, and he gave me a copy of the New Testament that we're going to use, and I just flipped it open to a random page, and there was a discussion of halachic issues. Now, halacha, how many people know what halacha is? Okay, so halacha in Judaism is Jewish law, and so traditional Judaism is based upon Jewish law and is based upon debates over what constitutes Jewish law. So you've heard, of course, in the Jewish food laws are very famous. So you have things that Jews are allowed to eat, things that are not allowed. Jews are not allowed to eat. When I was in Alabama, I decided I wanted to taste pigs, so I went from Mobile. I drove all the way up to Montgomery to the fanciest restaurant, and I sat down. I ordered a whole suckling pig, and just as it arrived at the table, the president of my congregation walks into the restaurant. So I'm a fast thinker on my feet. So as he walked over to me, he's walking this way, the waiter's walking this way, puts this beautiful suckling pig down in front of me. The president shakes my hand, then he looks down at the table, and before he can even react, I say, "This is such a wonderful restaurant. I ordered a baked apple, and look at how they make it so fancy." So that was a very but we have this whole system of laws, and they're based partly on the Bible, partly on the Talmud. And so here we bring in another element. The Talmud was transcripts of discussions by the rabbis. The rabbis are, according to many but not all scholars, the heirs of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are well known from the New Testament. Now, I knew about the Pharisees from Jewish history, but I was shocked to see that the portrayal of the Pharisees in the New Testament is quite different from that that I was familiar with, partly because the New Testament is dealing with very specific incidents and very specific inter-Jewish competition and rivalries and conflict. And so, in contrast to that, our temple, we're very harmonious. We never fight here. We never have these sorts of angry discussions and sense of competition. Everyone here gets along just like the lion and the lamb. But that was apparently not true in Second Temple Judaism. And that's really one of the major points about this, that Jesus lived in late Second Temple period. And so if we're going to understand historical Jesus, to the extent we can understand historical Jesus, we have to understand the atmosphere in the late Second Temple period. And the Romans were, of course, controlling Israel, and they had their own system of empire, which was pretty harsh. And there was a constant sense of a desire to overthrow the Romans. Now, of course, the problems had started when originally certain Jewish leaders had invited the Romans in. So in some senses, we created our own problems, and it's like, beware of help that you may ask for, because later you may not be able to get these, the people that you asked to come in to help you may not want to leave. And so, and this is one of the central questions of Paula Fredrickson's book. So Riva Litt is our infallible, intrepid chair of our adult education committee. And Riva and I had multiple discussions about this course, and she said, nobody will take it. And I said, well, Leonard and Michael will take it, and I'll do it with the two of them. And she said, okay, so we'll just have the three of you, and you can have coffee and talk to your heart's delight. I said, no, there'll be more than that. Leonard will bring Cheryl. And so, but here we are. But when we're talking about which book, we wanted a book from a Jewish writer. So because we're here looking at Jesus from a Jewish point of view. Now, there's a lot of scholars that would write from a very similar, if not identical, perspective. But I thought it would be just nice to have a Jewish writer. And so there's a whole subgroup of scholars, Jewish women, who specialize in Jesus. And I already mentioned Amy Jill Levine and her book. And this I do recommend if you're interested in this topic in depth. Not only is there a Jewish commentary, but in the back there's all sorts of essays to give background on the Jewish background of Jesus, such as Jewish, the early Jewish Christian groups, the concept of the neighbor, the messianic movements, the definition of Judaism, the word Judaism in Greek, and many more. But for our book, we chose Paula Fredrickson's Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, A Jewish Life and the Emergence of Christianity. I like that better than Amy Jill Levine's book. We'd suggested that you would read Introduction and Chapter 1. How many people were able to do that for today? Okay, you can lie, it's okay. So we may ask you to do that for next week, because most people haven't done it, we'll discuss that more. I will come back to this a little bit. She comes up with her own theory about how to understand Jesus in the context of Second Temple Judaism. Now, my basic starting point here is that that is sort of obvious to me, but may not be obvious to all the Christians here, and certainly wasn't over the last couple of hundred years, and that is Jesus was born a Jew, lived as a Jew, practiced religion as a Jew, and died a Jew. And so it is only in the aftermath of his death that a new religion slowly emerged. Or maybe I shouldn't say slowly, because it emerged quite quickly and grew incredibly rapidly. And there's been a lot of books. There's a sociologist, Rodney Stark, who did quite a bit of studying why and how did Christianity grow so quickly. Because most scholars believe that already in the first generation after Jesus' death, the majority of Christians were what they might call Gentile Christians. So, and the background to that is that the earliest followers of Jesus were all Jews, and they spoke in Aramaic, and they lived in Galilee and in Israel more generally. And so, and they saw Jesus as fulfilling certain roles in Judaism. Now, what exactly those roles were is something we'll talk about in the coming couple of weeks. But one of the roles that may have been, that some, but not all, of his followers may have felt is that Jesus was likely the Messiah. So, a few words about Messiah. But before I do that, are there any comments or questions? So we want to make this fairly interactive. I don't have a microphone for you, so I'm just gonna ask you to stand and say your name and talk really loud and keep your comment to 60 seconds or so. So are there any comments or questions at this point? And we'll take a couple of opening. So to say your name and talk loud.
I'm Leslie. Is this loud? Yeah. Yep. It said in the email when I signed up that you can bring any New Testament version. However, do you suggest to use this one?
Not necessarily. I mean, if we refer to a New Testament passage, it's going to be pretty much the same. If you're going to buy one and you're interested in the Jewish context of the New Testament, this is good, but you don't need it. It can be quite a different perspective, but you'll get that in part from me. So it's just sort of an option. Like Riva loves to have books, and so if I suggest a couple of books, she buys those, and she buys several others. And so I specifically talked about it because I wanted to emphasize the particular approach, but you don't need it. If you've been in a hotel recently, you may have found that the Gideon Bibles don't seem to be in the drawers anymore. So, because someone in this august group before us was in a hotel last week, and they said I was counting on stealing the Bible from the hotel to bring to the course, and I said I think they want you to take it. So they said, but the problem was when I opened all the drawers, there was no Gideon Bible anywhere to be found. I may have to go to Amazon and buy one. And so they were pretty horrified, but I suppose the Sun City used bookstore up in the rec center probably has a bunch of New Testaments for it still is, I think, the best-selling book of all time. And so
another good source of used books is the Latter-day Saints second-hand store on 67th and Bell.
Oh, yes,
on the
okay.
Southwest corner.
Okay, 67th and Bell, southwest corner. The Mormon thrift store has a good book section. And
Very good.
okay, and your name is,
Nicholas Reachback
and you're the Quaker
at times.
at times. Yes, your name?
My name is Jack Coate, and we have a commonality. My great-great-great-great-great-grandparents came from Wales and are Quakers. Two things. One, tagging on to yours, having read this, it's very true to at least 6 different versions of the New Testament I have at home. So it's, I mean, the verbiage, the annotation is what's really fascinating. And the other thing, I appreciate you pointing out that so many Christians don't realize that Jesus was a Jew. I'm sorry, he was a Jew, folks.
Now,
So was my mother. So.
now the other side of that is that if we Bob.
I'm Bob. I'd like to also mention that it's also free online. You don't have to pay.
Oh, that's right. Yes, so you can download it free from.
I hate to affect Bible
Now, that's very true. So that's the easiest thing. Bring your tablet and use the PDF version. Now, your name?
Jack.
Jack said that, of course, Jesus was a Jew, but from a faith point of view, Jesus doesn't have to be a Jew, right? So if moving away from the history, from the rational side, our religion can develop in different ways. And so, you've all seen Jesus portrayed in 150 different ways that are ways that the individual worshipers or communities can identify with. So there's, from a religious point of view, that's perfectly legitimate. From a historical point of view, of course, it's not. So there's a big difference. Marilyn, introduce yourself and then loud.
Marilyn Myron. Okay, so you and I were having a discussion yesterday about this. This is all oral history. All that we are about to do is assumed information because they didn't write it then. So from a historical point of view, we have to take this as an assumption, correct? There is very little. Ms. Fredrickson says there is some, but there is very little to back up all that we are going to be discussing. Is that not correct?
That is correct. I didn't plant Marilyn to ask that question, but it is correct. And so one of the big problems, of course, is that Jesus and his followers spoke Aramaic. We don't know how many of the original followers, could write, but they spoke and understood Aramaic, which was the language at the time. And now I speak and read Hebrew pretty well, and English, of course, and I know some Aramaic because it's the language of the Talmud, but I'm not sure exactly how good my Aramaic is. And believe it or not, about a year ago, I was in TJ Maxx, and so no problem. I was in TJ Maxx, and I don't know how I started talking to the checkout person, because you usually go through really quickly, but she told me she was a Syriac Christian from Iran, and her native language was Aramaic. So I said, I'm Jewish and I know some Aramaic. So she said, speak Aramaic to me and I'll. So the only thing I really could think of was the mourner's Kaddish, Yit Gadal v'Yit Gadash, and I didn't want to frighten her. So I said, you talk to me in Aramaic and I'll tell you if I understand. So she started talking, I couldn't make out a word. But I think if Jesus were to show up here, I'm sure that I would be able to communicate with him better than most people. I mean, he would know some Hebrew from the Torah, and I would know some Aramaic, and between those two things, we would be able to communicate. I'm not sure how familiar he'd be with modern Israeli Hebrew, but I'm sure that we'd be able to communicate. So all the writings of the early Christian church are in Greek. So and as we already said, they're 20 years or 40 years or 60 years later, written primarily or exclusively by people that did not personally know Jesus, were not witnesses to any of the events of Jesus' life and mission. Now, we do know that many Jews at this time were going around and speaking and trying to develop clienteles, trying to develop followings, and that Jesus was only one of many hundreds of such people. One of the questions is, was he primarily speaking about in religious terms, or was he also speaking as a political organizer? In other words, was he trying to foment revolution against Rome? Rochelle.
Yes, this lady over here has her hand.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Your name?
I'm Susan,
Hi, Susan.
and I'm non-denominational, and I also have a degree in history, and I specialize in classical. Two comments. There was Flavius Josephus did mention Jesus in the historical context. And also, you might want to watch Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, where they spoke in Latin and Aramaic. So if you want to exposure to Aramaic, that's a good source.
Yes, I heard about that. I didn't see it. But
I did recognize in Vino Veritas. I had Latin.
So there were many such individuals going around Israel at this time. Jesus' career started in the Galilee, as we know, and the Galilee had very different cultural and societal characteristics than Judea, which was now the word Jews comes from Judea, right? So Judea is the area around Jerusalem, and Judea was filled with Judeans, and Judeans became later Jews.
And Benjamites.
And Benjamites as well. So there's the 12 tribes, right? And then the story of the lost tribes, that every once in a while they say they found some of them in India or Burma or wherever else. And so, but the truth is that they pretty much stayed where they were, and there were and further up there was the Jews and the Samaritans split at an earlier point, and that comes into the New Testament as well with the story of the there you go, the Good Samaritan. And so, yes, your name.
My name's Mike. You made the comment that no one was there to document what happened. Isn't the same true that no one was there when Abraham lived and when Isaac lived?
Yes. So,
doesn't Yom, that notion of nobody being there affect both of our points of view?
right. So that's a great point, Mike. So everything that I said here about Jesus and about the founding of Christianity is true even more so for the founding of Judaism. Whether Mike referred to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or you can go forward. So historically, you could go forward to Moses, which is hundreds of years after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but there's no historical evidence for any of that. So So I don't. So that's I guess what we're talking here about the differentiation between faith and history, because for both Judaism and Christianity, if you want to be a believing, practicing Jew or Christian, you have to take a lot of this on faith, because it can't be documented historically. And really, documenting it historically is besides the point, right? Because if you're part of the faith community, then you're part of the faith community. And whether something happened in a certain historical way, or can be proven or not proven, or even disproven, doesn't really matter. So for me, as a Jew and as a rabbi, I'm a follower of Moses, but it doesn't matter to me if Moses actually existed or not. So if Moses didn't exist, he's still as much reality, and his teachings and the relationships that he built religiously are equally important to me. So there's a certain truth that transcends history, if that makes sense. Mike, did you want to respond?
Save it for later.
Okay, so let me get back to the issue of messianism. So messianism was a very prominent feature of Second Temple Judaism, and so you have a situation where the Romans have been invited in, and then they stay as unwelcome guests past their, what is it said that when you invite people to stay over, I'm planning a 5-week trip to Israel, and I'm trying to stay with friends there as much as possible. And one of my other friends said, you can't ask to stay there for 2 weeks. That's not going to work out very well. And what is it like? You should only stay 2 nights? Is that the 3 days? So 3 days, is that 3 nights or 3 days, 2 nights? 3 nights.
That sounds like a Jewish debate.
Okay, that's something we have to debate, but you have to keep it limited. But the Romans didn't want to do that, and they had the military might to be able to enforce their stay. And possibly as a result of that, the idea that the Jews needed a king to come back was pushed to the forefront. So originally God didn't want the Jews to have a king, and the Jews kept saying to God, "We need a king. We need a king." Why did they want it? And this eventually led to the anointment of Saul as the original king. This is roughly a little bit before 1000 BCE. Now, I use BCE before the Common Era as a more generic term, because BC is before Christ. Christ means the Messiah. So since Jews don't accept Jesus as Messiah, then we just use BCE. And instead of AD, we use CE, Common Era. So Saul was appointed as king. That didn't work out that well. And then David and Solomon were appointed as kings after that from a different line. That worked out a little bit better. But then the children of Solomon split the kingdom into 2, and we went back to not having a unified kingdom. So why did they want a king? Well, countries that had kings were able to build stronger militaries, because the king could requisition goods and draft people, and that was how you build a stronger country. So now this wasn't necessarily pleasant, because your taxes went up and your sons might get drafted, but it was a way to preserve the country. And as you know, the ancient Judeans and ancient Israel, once it became 2 separate countries, were surrounded by all sorts of competitive tribes. And so the Israelites felt that they needed a king, and God eventually gave in and made a king. And so this was now long gone. The height of the united monarchy was almost 1,000 years before, and Jews felt we're in bigger trouble now. We need a king more than ever. But there was no king anymore. And so we want a new king. But now who should the king be? Well, the king has to be a descendant of David, right? Because David was the original king, the successful king, discounting Saul. And so therefore, the new king has to be a direct descendant of the old king. Now this, we're talking about, I don't know, 20 generations, but there still are presumably descendants of David. So this was the first requirement. Another requirement might be that the king come from a particular place, which was Bethlehem, and so forth and so on. The king has to be a male. He has to be halakhically observant, and he has to then unite all the Jews and rebuild a kingdom. There was already a temple functioning, and the temple plays an important role in the New Testament as well. And we'll talk about that a little more over the course of the next few weeks. And so the Messiah was just going to be a candidate to become a king.
We are a matrilineal society. Therefore, is the house of David through Mary?
The
House of David.
the way that I understand it is that in terms of the king descendant, it would go through the male line. So this is a little bit complicated because in contemporary Judaism, in traditional Judaism, Jewish identity passes through the mother. And in Reform Judaism, just parenthetically, Jewish identity can pass through the mother or the father. The Reform movement about 40 or 50 years ago passed the patrilineal descent resolution that said either patrilineal or matrilineal descent is good enough to pass on Jewish identity. But in terms of the Davidic dynasty heritage, that would, I believe, go through the male line. Now, this would be consistent with the priestly passing of priestly heritage. So I'm a rabbi by training. I have a PhD in Jewish history from Tel Aviv University, and my rabbinical degree is from Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. But I'm also a Kohen, a priest. So if the Messiah does come, according to Jews, we believe the Messiah hasn't come yet, and all Jews return to Israel, and if there's no more jobs as Reform rabbis, I could presumably get a job in the temple as a Kohen, as a priest, and I could do some of the sacrifices and so on. So I'm thinking about the future and about employment after Sun City, if it comes to that. But as a Kohen, I became a Kohen not because I studied or not because I did anything at all, but because some point when I was in, I don't know, 4th or 5th grade, my father just turned to me and said, "Oh, we're Cohens." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, my father told me we're Cohens, and so I'm telling you." And it was not a surprise because Kaplan, I was told Kaplan is Russian, meaning Cohen. And so if our name was Cohen, it made sense that we were Cohens. So I said, okay, and I was a little bit proud of it. But in Reform Judaism, we don't really have Cohens because it's a hereditary title. So it's kind of like Prince Charles, right? He got to where he is because of who his parents were, not because of anything he did. And in Reform Judaism, we don't really accept that idea. So as a rabbi, I studied, so I get to be a rabbi. But you have to study for it or earn it in some way by what you do or what you think or what you know, not just because of who your parents are. So when we call people up to the Torah this past Friday night, we called Miriam up for the Torah, and then we called Warren up for the Torah, and I put their names down pretty much randomly. But if this was an Orthodox synagogue, the Kohen would get called first, the Levi second, and then after that, Israel. And of course, Miriam is a woman. Sorry, Miriam, you wouldn't get called up at all. But leaving the gender issue aside, you would have a hierarchy based on birth. But the Kohens go through the male. So for the king to go through the male, that seems a logical thing. And in fact, Jewish identity in the Second Temple period, up until somewhere in the Second Temple period, also went through the male line. And so then in the Talmud, though, it suddenly says you are a Jew if your mother's Jewish. And this reverses what is in the Bible. Because, for example, King Solomon, how many wives did he have? Does anybody know the number? Mary Gill? I think it was hundreds. And many of these women came from foreign parts, and there was a problem because some of them brought their idols with them when they moved into the marital habitation. But that didn't bother Solomon or anyone around him because his children were Jewish because he was Jewish. Not just Jewish, he was the king. So it didn't matter who the mother was. Later, though, in the Talmudic period, the rabbis, without explanation, shifted it from the male line to the female line. But they didn't shift other things, such as the Kohanim. The Kohanim remained male to male, masculine line, and also the Messianic line. So here we have a concept of a Messiah. Now, this concept evolved in both Judaism and Christianity, and it became more of a religious concept rather than a political concept. And so then there were statements in the prophets that maybe the Messiah would bring world peace, the Messiah would rebuild the temple when the temple was destroyed, and so forth. Now, just a couple of words about the temple, but I'll pause here for just a minute for a few more comments or questions about Messiah or about anything related to that. Yes?
Yes, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and that's from 1 Kings 11:3.
I don't know how he could have coped. Say that one more time. That's
700 wives and 300 concubines.
all right. Wow.
And if you believe in reincarnation, some people think that Brigham Young was a reincarnation, which would sort of fit.
Yes.
Rabbi, couldn't they change the Jewish lineage from men to the women? Because during the Crusades, there were so many rapes that nobody knew who the child's father was or what the child's father was.
Thank you. That is the commonly given explanation. But I don't believe that the Talmud itself says that. They just said Jewish descent follows the matriarchal line, and we obviously know that that was not true before that. I don't think they say it. Now, so then historians, scholars would say, well, why would the sages of the Talmud shift it so, make it opposite? And the logical reason was that there were a lot of rapes at that time, and so that would be a logical explanation. But I'm very cautious of logical explanations. They appear to be correct. Maybe they're correct, but maybe they're not. We don't know. I'm still hoping we'll find some video interviews with some of the early rabbis in one of these caves. When I go to Israel, I'm going to climb in a few caves and see if I can find some old VHS recordings. Yes, Pam. This is Pam.
Does Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, so to speak, does he have any connection to the house of David, or does he have any?
Who wants to answer that?
Yes, if you, in the annotated New Testament, in the book of Mark, Mark and Matthew, the first book, it goes down the whole bloodline from David all the way to Joseph. I mean, that's like the whole first chapter is like all going down. You know, begat. They count the genealogy of Jesus, Messiah, the son of David. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, yada, 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 all the way down to, and Nathan the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, whose Jesus was born, is called Messiah. So it goes on for 17 verses in the first chapter. Yeah.
And the genealogical concerns in the New Testament are a continuation of genealogical concerns in the Hebrew Bible. I don't use the term Old Testament, right, because Old Testament implies that there's a New Testament, and for Jews there is no New Testament. However, Alan Siegel of Barnard College and others, he wrote a book called Rebecca's Daughters, and he argues that you have ancient Israelite religion, and then around this time you have a split between early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. And he says Rabbinic Judaism is almost as different from ancient Israelite religion as is Christianity, early Christianity. And so it's sort of like you've got the ancient Israelite religion and then a split in two different directions, both of which deviate quite a bit from the ancient traditions going back to the Bible. And this led, of course, in medieval times to a lot of the disputations where the Christians said we're the rightful heirs of the Hebrew Bible, and the Jews said, no, we're the rightful heirs of the Jewish Bible. As a Jew, of course, I think that we Jews are the rightful heirs of the Jewish Bible. But you can certainly interpret it both ways. Bob?
Well, I was just thinking about the lineages, and then I was thinking about the Messiah being a divine character, and how you go from a human being to a divine character, whether or not it's a Christian Messiah or a Jewish Messiah.
That's why we're taking the class.
But in Judaism, the Messiah,
We go from human to divine.
so in Judaism, we don't believe that, nobody, Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, nobody believes that the Messiah is going to be divine.
Right.
So
At this time, before, that's what caused part of the schism, is we had good Jews that said, hey, wait a minute, this guy's on to something.
And so some of the early Jews, as Michael says, became followers of Jesus, and then they moved their ideas into, and we'll get into that hopefully in the next few weeks. But the shock of your leader, who you expect is going to become the king, dying prematurely and not fulfilling what you expect to happen, can be quite profound. And you have another example of that in contemporary Jewish life, which is the Chabad Lubavitch group. And they had their Rebbe, who they loved dearly, and then 25 or so years ago, he dies. And they were really expecting he was going to become the Messiah. And so, similarly to the very earliest Christians, it appears that at least some of the Chabad people do not really accept that he's gone, that they feel that he's going to come back and be the Messiah. And so I pointed out this is exactly the same situation that occurred with early Christianity. And of course, the Chabad people don't see any parallels whatsoever. But things don't necessarily change so much. We're running out of our hour, so I'll take a couple of quick comments, and then I'll go over to Riva to say goodbye. Michael.
We have to remember that the New Testament, or whatever you want to call it, was written by Hebrews.
Michael says that we have to remember the New Testament was written by Hebrews or Jews, and that's probably true. Do remember that, what are the four Gospels? And who wrote, what are the names of people that wrote those four?
They were Greeks, most of them.
But what were their names?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
But what were their real names?
We don't know.
We don't know, thank you. So they were assigned names, but we have no idea who wrote them. And so that's part of the problem. So we don't know 100% that they were written by Jews. There's different theories about this. For example, which is the first book there? Matthew. And Matthew is the most Jewish of the books, as we'll see. And Matthew argues very clearly that to be a follower of Jesus, you must remain a completely halakhically observant Jew. But nevertheless, in other places, he seems to blame the Jews for all sorts of terrible things. So Matthew is at one and the same time the most Jewish of the four writers, and on the other hand seems in some ways the most hostile. And so how do you reconcile this? One possible way of reconciling it is that there was multiple writers, that somebody wrote part of it, or early Jewish follower of Jesus, and then someone else came around and added certain things that were more hostile. And so there's sort of an editing process. Yes?
Yeah, I might add that Mark, the book of Mark really preceded Matthew.
Oh, yes,
Matthew,
yes.
Added on from Mark, and the other source says it's Q, or Christ.
Correct.
The source is given with the source. That may be a document that Mark had so that he could put things down himself, the way he saw things. It's actually Q, then Mark, then Matthew, then
Your name again is?
Nick.
Nick. So Nick is pointing out that Matthew is the first book, but it's not the first one written. There was probably Mark and a document that has subsequently been lost, which has been called Q. And so those two documents appear to be the earliest documents. One or two final thoughts, short thoughts, and then over to Riva. Okay, Riva, come forward, and
it's such a pleasure to see such a variety of people and such a good reception to this class. I have a final survey question for everybody. How many of you have family members of another faith? That's nearly the entire room. One of the reasons we pulled together this workshop is to address the issue, how can we develop a deeper understanding of one another and their faiths? And so it's such a treat to see what a variety we have here today. I have a couple of very specific announcements. One is we debated about how to offer this book, the Jesus of Nazareth, the one, Paula Fredrickson's one that the rabbi has mentioned. We weren't quite sure whether it should be suggested or recommended, but it was not required for participation in this workshop. In some of the emails I sent out to you, I asked you if you would like to have a PDF copy. Some people did respond, and I sent them copies of the PDF. I've now learned that more of you are interested in having copies of this book available on PDF. and I will be blasting it to everybody who is registered for this class. A final announcement is not everybody is here today who registered for this class. It's even more than all of you who are here today. We have quite a few people who said they could not attend the first class, but they wanted to register for it. And so we've made arrangements to have this program today video recorded. And for all of you who are registered, we will send you the link so that you can hear it on video and see it on video. And also for those who had to miss today's class, we are also making it available on video. That's true for all 4 of these classes. If, for whatever reason, you cannot attend one of these classes, we hope to be able to send you a video link so that you can observe all of the 4 classes. Again, I want to thank you all for coming here today and bringing so much diversity to our community. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.